Imagine hearing metal tear apart at 24,000 feet, the sharp crack of structural failure followed by the explosive roar of air rushing out of the aircraft. In an instant, the entire tail section of Japan Airlines Flight 123 rips away from the Boeing 747, taking with it every system that keeps the aircraft controllable. The massive jumbo jet lurches violently upward, then begins an uncontrolled oscillation between climb and dive. "524 souls are trapped aboard what has just become a flying coffin, careening through Japanese airspace with no way to steer, no way to control altitude, and no way to land safely." This is August 12, 1985. What began as a routine domestic flight from Tokyo to Osaka has just become the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history. But here's what makes this tragedy even more devastating. According to official investigation reports, this disaster was entirely preventable. 7 years earlier, this exact aircraft had suffered a tail strike during landing. The repair that followed, a repair that should have taken 30 minutes, was botched when Boeing mechanics cut corners and violated their own procedures. Investigators found they used a single row of rivets where the manual called for 2. They created a weak spot that would slowly crack and fail over thousands of flights, like a ticking time bomb waiting for the right moment to explode. That moment came on a warm summer evening over the mountains of Japan, when 520 people discovered that a simple repair job had just become their death sentence. 32 minutes earlier, Flight 123 pushes back from Gate 18 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport at 6:04 p.m. Captain Masami Takahama, 49 years old, settles into the left seat. He's accumulated over 12,400 total flight hours, including more than 4,850 hours in the Boeing 747. His experience shows in the smooth, methodical way he runs through the pre-flight checks. In the right seat, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki brings 3,963 total hours of experience. Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda rounds out the cockpit crew with 9,831 hours of flight time. All three are seasoned professionals, veterans of Japan Airlines' rigorous training program. Behind them, 12 flight attendants are preparing the cabin for what should be a routine 54-minute flight to Osaka. The passenger list includes families heading to the Kansai region for the Obon holiday, business travelers, and children excited about their summer vacation. None of them know they're sitting aboard JA8119, a Boeing 747SR that Boeing mechanics had improperly repaired 7 years earlier. None of them know that with every flight cycle, every pressurization and depressurization, a crack has been slowly growing in the aircraft's rear pressure bulkhead. Flight 123 takes off from runway 15L at 6:12 p.m., climbing into the clear evening sky. The departure is routine. Air traffic control clears them to climb to flight level 240. Everything appears normal as they head southwest toward Osaka Bay. At 6:24 p.m. and 35 seconds, climbing through 23,900 feet near Izu Peninsula, their world ends. The rear pressure bulkhead, the curved wall that separates the pressurized passenger cabin from the unpressurized tail section, fails catastrophically. The explosion of escaping air is so violent that it blows apart the aircraft's entire vertical stabilizer, the massive fin that keeps the plane flying straight. Hydraulic fluid lines running through the tail are severed, instantly draining all three of the aircraft's independent hydraulic systems. In the cockpit, the crew feels the aircraft lurch violently upward. Warning lights illuminate across the instrument panel. The stick shaker activates, warning of an impending stall. The plane begins climbing at an impossible angle, threatening to flip over backward. Captain Takahama's voice, captured by the cockpit voice recorder and later released in investigation transcripts. What happened? The aircraft pitches up to 39 degrees, so steep that passengers are thrown back into their seats, unable to move. Children are screaming. Adults are praying. The Boeing 747 climbs from 24,000 feet to nearly 25,000 feet in seconds, driven by the explosive force of the decompression. Flight engineer Fukuda, fighting the violent motion of the aircraft. Rapid decompression? We're losing cabin pressure? First Officer Sasaki struggles with the controls. Hydraulic pressure dropping. All systems. In the cabin, oxygen masks drop from the ceiling as the aircraft depressurizes. But many passengers can't reach them. The violent climbing angle has them pinned in their seats. Flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never for anything like this, struggle to move through the tilted cabin. Then, as suddenly as it began climbing, the aircraft pitches nose down into a terrifying dive. The Boeing 747 plummets from 25,000 feet toward the earth below. Passengers who moments before were crushed into their seats are now thrown forward against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open. Luggage and personal items become projectiles flying through the cabin. Captain Takahama pulls back on the control stick with all his strength, but nothing happens. The hydraulic systems that power the elevators, rudder, and ailerons are completely dead. The aircraft is flying on pure aerodynamics now, with no way to control its flight path. Uncontrollable, First Officer Sasaki radios to Tokyo Control. That single word captures the absolute horror of their situation. They're flying a 300-ton aircraft that no longer responds to any control input. The Boeing 747 has become a giant glider, but one that's oscillating violently between climbs and dives in what pilots call phugoid oscillations. Back on the ground, air traffic controllers watch in disbelief as the radar blip representing Flight 123 traces an erratic path across their screens. The aircraft climbs to 25,000 feet, then dives to 22,000 feet, then climbs again. Each oscillation takes it closer to the mountainous terrain of central Japan. In the cockpit, Captain Takahama and First Officer Sasaki are attempting something that has never been done successfully: flying a large commercial airliner using only engine thrust. With no flight controls, their only option is to add power to engines on one side, to turn in that direction, reduce power to turn the other way. It's called power lever steering, and the physics are brutal. The Boeing 747's engines are mounted far below the center of gravity, so any change in thrust creates violent pitching moments. Add power, and the nose pitches up. Reduce power, and the nose drops. There's no way to make smooth control inputs. Flight engineer Fukuda is running through emergency checklists, desperately trying to restore hydraulic pressure to at least one of the three systems. He tries manual extension of the landing gear, hoping that might restore some control authority. Nothing works. The explosion that destroyed the tail has severed every hydraulic line that runs through that section of the aircraft. The crew contacts Tokyo Control, requesting vectors back to Haneda Airport. But even as they make the request, they know it's hopeless. The aircraft won't respond to their control inputs. They can't maintain altitude. They can't change heading reliably. They're flying a machine that has become fundamentally uncontrollable. JAL 123. This is Tokyo Control. Are you able to control the aircraft? Negative. Uncontrollable. In the passenger cabin, people are beginning to understand that something is terribly wrong. The violent oscillations continue, climbing steeply, then diving toward the earth, then climbing again. Some passengers remain calm, helping others with oxygen masks and trying to comfort frightened children. Others panic, realizing they may be living through their final moments. Flight attendant Yumi Ochiai, who would later become one of only 4 survivors, moves through the cabin despite the aircraft's violent movements. She sees passengers writing notes, farewell messages to their families. Some write on the backs of boarding passes, others find scraps of paper. In neat handwriting, in shaky scrawl, in messages composed with the care of final words, passengers pour out their love for the families they would never see again. These notes, found later among the wreckage, provide a heartbreaking glimpse into the minds of people who knew they were about to die. Back in the cockpit, the crew is fighting the impossible. They've been airborne for 18 minutes since the initial failure, and the situation is getting worse, not better. The aircraft's oscillations are becoming more severe. Each climb and dive cycle takes them closer to the mountain peaks of central Japan. Captain Takahama to Tokyo. Control, request return to Haneda. JAL 123, roger. Vectors to Haneda. Can you control your altitude? Uncontrollable. The radar controllers can see what the crew cannot. Flight 123 is heading directly toward Mount Fuji and the mountainous terrain beyond. At their current track and altitude, impact is inevitable unless they can somehow regain control of the aircraft. Tokyo Control offers alternatives. JAL 123, Nagoya Airport is available. Runway 34, 8,000 feet. But it doesn't matter which airport they choose. The Boeing 747 won't go where they want it to go. It climbs when they need it to descend. It turns when they need it to fly straight. The laws of physics have taken over, and physics doesn't care about runways or emergency procedures or the 524 lives depending on a miracle. 25 minutes after the initial failure, the aircraft is approaching the mountains at an altitude that offers no hope of clearing the peaks ahead. Flight engineer Fukuda continues working through emergency procedures, but they're running out of both time and altitude. First Officer Sasaki keys his radio for what will be the final transmission from Flight 123. JAL 123, uncontrollable. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants prepare passengers for impact. They demonstrate the brace position, heads down, hands clasped behind the neck. Some passengers comply. Others continue writing their final messages. Children cry for their parents. Parents hold their children close, whispering words of comfort they hope will somehow make the terror more bearable. The 4 survivors would later describe these final moments. The aircraft's nose pitching down into what felt like a final dive, the sound of metal groaning under impossible stresses, the moment when everyone realized that the next few seconds would determine whether they lived or died. At 6:56 p.m., 32 minutes after the pressure bulkhead failed, Flight 123 impacts the ridgeline of Mount Osutaka at 5,135 feet elevation. The Boeing 747 is traveling at approximately 350 miles per hour when it hits the trees. The impact destroys the aircraft instantly. The fuselage breaks apart, scattering wreckage across the mountainside. Of the 524 people on board, 520 die in the crash. 4 survive, all seated in the rear section of the aircraft. Their survival is nothing short of miraculous. All 4 were seated in the rear of the aircraft, in an area that somehow remained partially intact during the breakup. They would spend the night on the mountain, listening to the sounds of other survivors calling for help in the darkness. Voices that gradually fell silent as the hours passed. Rescue teams don't reach the crash site until the following morning. The remote location and difficult terrain make access nearly impossible in darkness. When they do arrive, They find the 4 survivors among the wreckage of what was once a Boeing 747, and the remains of 520 people who died because of a repair job that was done wrong 7 years earlier. The investigation reveals the full scope of what official reports determined was Boeing's repair failure. In 1978, aircraft JA 8119 had suffered a tail strike during landing at Osaka Airport. The impact damaged the rear pressure bulkhead, the curved wall that keeps the passenger cabin pressurized. Boeing mechanics were tasked with repairing the damage. The repair manual called for a specific procedure: remove the damaged section, install a new piece with 2 rows of rivets, and use splice plates that properly overlap the joint to distribute stress loads. It was standard work that Boeing mechanics had performed hundreds of times. But according to investigation findings, the mechanics assigned to JA 8119 didn't follow the manual. They used a single row of rivets instead of 2. They installed a splice plate that didn't properly overlap the joint. They created a stress concentration, a weak point where cracks could initiate and grow with each flight cycle. The faulty repair passed inspection. JA 8119 returned to service with Japan Airlines, who had no way to know they were operating an aircraft with a hidden structural defect. For 7 years, the crack grew larger with each pressurization cycle. By August 1985, it had reached critical size. When Flight 123 climbed through 24,000 feet that evening, the pressure differential between the cabin and the outside air finally exceeded the damaged bulkhead's ability to contain it. The explosion that followed destroyed the aircraft's tail and killed 520 people. Boeing faced lawsuits and eventually paid settlements to victims' families, though the company's legal responsibility was disputed for years. New regulations required more frequent inspections of pressure bulkheads, and repair procedures were revised across the industry. But none of these changes could bring back Captain Takahama, who fought until the end to save an aircraft that couldn't be saved. None could restore the lives of First Officer Sasaki and Flight Engineer Fukuda, who spent their final 32 minutes doing everything humanly possible to land their crippled aircraft. And none could return the 520 passengers who died on a mountainside because someone at Boeing decided that 1 row of rivets was good enough when the manual clearly called for 2. Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history, a testament to how a simple repair job done wrong can destroy hundreds of lives in an instant. This is the story of 32 minutes of terror that ended on Mount Osutaka, and the 4 survivors who lived to tell the world what really happened aboard Japan Airlines Flight 123. In memory of the 520 passengers and crew of Japan Airlines Flight 123,